There is perhaps no greater factor that affects your ability to attain English fluency than where you started with your native language.
So the question is, what can we do about it? What's up, guys, and welcome back to WaiGuo Friends English. Today we're talking about your native language, your mother tongue, your L1, if you will, and how that actually affects how you study English, how you study language.
The thing is languages are not black and white. You don't have just Mandarin. You don't have just Spanish. You don't have just English. You have mixtures of language, like Russian and Ukrainian coming together and mixing up and creating some kind of pidgin language, or you use words interchangeably, for example, or different Spanishes have different regional things. Different Englishes have different words in different countries and cultures that we mix together. So there's nothing that we really speak anymore that's purely one language.
So when we're going to talk about your first language in this entire video, just think about it in those terms, that we're just kind of seeing it from a very broad perspective.
What language did you grow up speaking?
We've had students that are from north and southern parts of China that, even though they would classify Mandarin as their native language, one had been more predominantly influenced by Cantonese, and so they would have these awkward pronunciations or grammar structures. They would misunderstand each other, even though they were speaking the same language.
Right, and this can happen region to region, state to state, county to county. It can be a family to family even. The thing is language is so complex, and people mix it up with their personality and their friends and inside jokes and puns, and everything gets mixed up. So to just start off, what we're referring to with the L1 is what you spoke initially. And some of you even spoke 2 or 3 languages from the beginning. Whatever you consider to be your L1, we're talking about this as a starting point in how that influences the way that you learn English.
Because you don't speak English from a vacuum or in a vacuum. When you speak English, when you're starting to speak in your L2, your second language, you're going to be largely using the rules that you grew up with. Why not? That's the assumption that everybody makes. It's the assumption that I make. But when you start to do this, you start to directly translate from that language into the next language, and we don't operate by those same rules. We don't operate by those same pronunciation habits that you have in your first language. And that interference is what it's called, makes English language learning really difficult.
But it also works for English speakers, for those of us who set out to learn languages. Some languages are more difficult than others for us to learn because we're starting with a certain grammar base. All of the world's languages are divided into large branches that are connected by the way that they structure their grammar, the way they pronounce things, and the way that they do language. And so languages like the Romantic languages with Italian and Spanish and French, they're able to learn those languages between them a lot easier than an English speaker would be able to learn Korean, for example. Where you start really does impact how quickly and how well and how efficiently you will be able to reach fluency in English.
Yeah, if you think about like a race, if you take a 400-meter dash and you say, this is the goal, 400 meters, but depending on where you start on that 400-meter track will depend on how quickly you get to the goal. And so for a Romantic language person trying to learn English, the starting line is probably going to be further ahead than a person that comes from a completely different language family, like from Arabic, for example.
So here are some things that we've found. With Ukrainians, for example, to be verbs, perfect tenses, they're difficult to do because they're different. Or the difference between would and could. In English, those two are different words. In Ukrainian, they are not.
Or like Chinese has the same thing where you have this kind of he and she mix up, because in Chinese, the pronunciation for the word he and she are the same. And so you often hear Chinese speakers say he, I mean she, and they do this regularly. Another thing that they struggle with oftentimes is conjugation and conjugating verbs. Not like they don't understand the grammar, but it's weird when you go from a Chinese language character-based system to all of a sudden have to change all these words all the time.
It makes it more difficult. Another one is Spanish adjective order. So instead of saying the white dog is mine, it's the dog white is mine, right? It's so small. It's these minor changes and shifts that you have to retrain habits in order to put on your English learning self.
Another good small one is like in Arabic, they will sometimes mix up the nominative case and the objective case. So for example, instead of saying, when I go to work, I wear a suit, They say, when I go to job, I wear a suit. Just some noun phrases like that sometimes get mixed up. And so as a native speaker, we hear that and say, that sounds really weird. When in reality, if you directly translate it from a sentence using a translation app or function, that makes sense. It does make sense. But that's the problem with fluency and trying to be more fluent is you got to be able to do these rules from their perspective, from their point of view, not from your own.
Language learning is very much like a cultural study. You've got to learn the culture, you've got to learn the perspectives, you've got to learn the paralanguage, you've got to learn the way that they do things and why. And you don't have to go through and learn all of their history and everything, but it certainly helps, but you don't have to. It is easier to come to English from certain languages than from others, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So other common struggles that you might see in terms of grammar has to do with the semantic range of prepositions.
Oh.
This is possibly the hardest one from language to language, regardless of what language you come from, because prepositions are very much culturally defined. It's like, are you on time? Are we going to meet on Saturday? Are we going to meet in Saturday? Or are we going to meet in this hour or in this time or at this time? In English, there's some flexibility there. In other languages, there's flexibility. For example, like Greek and English have very different uses of prepositions, even though they also overlap quite a bit. So there's a huge flexibility of prepositions that exists in these two languages that doesn't exist in Mandarin. Regardless of what language you're studying, like prepositions are possibly going to be one of the most difficult things you learn.
Some others are phrasal verbs, which you can find on this channel. In fact, we have a whole playlist devoted to phrasal verbs, or things like idioms and collocations.
Another thing that's really difficult for other English language learners is articles and determiners. When should you use a, an, and the? And when do you use some or any of the other quantifiers that exist that help determine things? These are very, very tricky. They're also somewhat defined because a and an versus the can sometimes just be a situational difference. So these are really difficult to learn.
And the last one that we have found is a very common struggle, regardless of what your first language is having that natural stress and pause that happens in that language. You can have the exact precise dictionary definition of the sentence that you're wanting to use. If you don't actually sound native or sound natural, then it's still going to be awkward. And so you need to be able to learn the natural pauses that you can make and the natural stress or tone or even pitch that makes you sound more fluent.
Just as a caveat before we go on, the key to learning a lot of this is to listen a lot. You've got to listen a lot in order to catch those pauses in the intonation, especially because you could read a list of rules for this, but if you don't have an ear for it, you're not going to be able to do it. You've got to get an ear for English by listening a lot.
Yeah. So then the question comes, what can you do? If so much of your language is already determined even before you start that race, even before the person says ready, set, go, what can you do? It almost seems like you might as well give up. But the answer is no, you should not give up. Because the reality is there's a lot of language, there's a lot of English that you can do even if you have the additional challenge of coming from a different language background. So for example, vocabulary learning and vocabulary growth, learning those idioms, learning those collocations, these are things that everybody's going to struggle with. So you can work on that now, even apart from additional help that others may get from coming from, like, let's say, French or German to study English.
Another thing that's super helpful is if you find a language tutor, somebody who particularly has studied your language and they understand your language. They understand where you come from. They understand why you make the mistakes that you do. Finding a tutor that can do this for you is phenomenally helpful in language learning. I cannot even begin to express that, but somebody who understands why you do the things that you do and they're not going to let it slip, they'll mark it down and they'll help coach you through correcting those habits so that you speak more fluently. This is so helpful. And having them to understand why you tend to make those mistakes and what you're trying to express. That is extremely helpful, especially early on as you start to develop those habits. But if you don't have a tutor for most of your English language learning, the most important time to have a language tutor is in the advanced levels, because this is where you've got to be finding the problems that you're making from intermediate levels. You've got to fix those, and you need somebody to identify them and help you fix them and keep you accountable to those changes. But you also need to ask deeper questions. You're going to be working with far more complex things. You're going to be working with vocabulary words, not in breadth, but in depth. So you're going to be working on synonyms to those words, what they really mean in different contexts. Why would you use this synonym instead of this synonym? That's in the advanced level. So to gain fluency, you've got to be working with somebody, and that will help it go a lot faster. Now remember, We've established this before in a previous video, but 20% of the time that you will invest in learning English, if you're going for fluency, is going to be spent from complete beginner all the way up to through the high intermediate level. After the high intermediate level, that's 80% of your time. It's going to be invested in these advanced levels and just trudging through it in order to get to fluency.
Yeah.
So having that language tutor really helps you speed up.
Maybe that language tutor isn't actually able to speak that language, perhaps, but as long as they have in-depth knowledge, maybe they have experience working with Ukrainian speakers, with Norwegian speakers, or whatever your first language is, that knowledge can help you expedite or make faster the language learning process.
Yes.
A little bit of cold water to the face here, though, is that you will never fully get over your first language. And that's actually a good thing. It's a good thing that you don't fully move away from your first language, because then you're like a bridge. If you fully moved away from your first language just to your second language, there would be no way you could go back. You'd have to relearn your first language completely. And it is a great thing to have both languages, both places that you can speak language in.
Yes, absolutely. There's always going to be some kind of interference, but remember that the goal of fluency is to be able to communicate well and to communicate spontaneously and to be able to communicate with not as much effort. And so if you're trying to go beyond fluency and into mastery, that's going to be a lot more work and it's going to be a lot more time, to be honest. But even still, even if you gained full mastery of the English language, you're still not going to completely lose touch with your L1. That's just not the way it works. If you want to know more about what trudging through the advanced levels is like in order to reach fluency, we have a video right here about the difference between advanced and fluent English. What is it like? What are you aiming for really? What is it going to take to get through it? We talk about all of these things in this video right here. So if you've got a minute, go ahead and jump over there and watch that video.
And check back next week because we're going to have more videos coming up.
Yeah. Bye, guys.